What if I told you a 76-year-old widow became the only friend of a Bigfoot family in Montana's wilderness? Sounds impossible, right? Yet this true story transformed an entire town forever. What few people know is that one stormy night in the late 1980s, Eleanor Briggs followed a cry of pain into the forest and freed a trapped creature most of us believe is only legend. From that moment, something invisible formed between them. Not fear, but trust. This isn't just folklore. Local records and newspaper reports from Granite Peak tell of the mysterious bond that grew between a grieving woman and the giants of the mountains. Stay with me, and you'll witness how an isolated widow found meaning again through an unspoken exchange of gifts, how two completely different worlds learned to trust one another, and how an entire town shifted from skepticism to reverence. Witnesses even recall seeing three towering figures watching silently from the tree line at Eleanor's funeral. And the next morning, in the snow around her cabin, a perfect circle of giant footprints appeared, like a final farewell. Don't look away, because if you hear this story through to the end, you'll realize that sometimes the most moving truths are hidden inside the mysteries we've always been told, our myths. The last leaf on the birch tree clung like memory. It trembled in the wind, amber and thin-veined, casting a crooked shadow across the porch floorboards of Eleanor Briggs's cabin. October light fell sideways through the trees, soft gold, like the breath of something older than time. A squirrel chattered nearby, then silence again, thick and private, the kind only deep woods knew how to keep. Granite Peak stretched behind her home like a cathedral made of pine and silence. At 76, Eleanor knew its moods the way a mother knows her child's breathing. She'd lived here long enough to tell when the deer had gone lower into the valley, when a bobcat had padded through, when something else stirred among the canopies. She rarely left the ridge these days. A weekly visit into the dirt road town below for flour, canned milk, and dog food, though she hadn't kept a dog since her setter passed away 3 winters ago. People in town called her Miss Ellie, or just nodded with polite smiles. They didn't ask much anymore. They remembered. Everyone did. The accident had carved a scar too deep for small talk. It had been 20 years, but it still lingered, fresh in the pine-sweet cold. Her only child, Peter, had begged to go hunting that autumn afternoon. 16, proud, tall like his father. She'd packed sandwiches and warned him not to stray near the northern gorge. He'd kissed her cheek and joked, "You worry too much, Ma." By dusk, the sheriff came. The shot had been an accident. That's what they said. The safety slipped. The rifle went off. The forest took more than it ever gave back. Eleanor had stopped playing music after that. The piano keys gathered dust. The old hymnal curled at the corners. But years later, she found a music box tucked in the sewing chest, an old gift from Peter, bought with lawn mowing money, chipped and wooden. When she turned the crank, it still played "Come Thou Fount," softly, like a whisper through church rafters. Every night, after lighting the little oil lamp beneath the framed photo of Peter and her late husband Frank, she'd play the music box once. Just once. Then silence. Then sleep. That night in October, something in the wind felt shifted. A stillness that didn't belong. She'd stacked her firewood early that morning, wrists aching from the chill. Soup simmered on the stove. She patched an old flannel coat. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as twilight thickened, she noticed the hush. Not the usual kind, the deep, warm quiet of the woods bedding down, but a watchful quiet, as if the trees themselves had stopped breathing. Eleanor stood at her window, teacup in hand. The trail into the trees looked the same. Her geraniums wilted from the frost. The horizon glowed faintly orange behind the peaks, like the sky hadn't decided yet if it wanted to sleep or burn. She turned away, meaning to lock the door early. That's when she heard it, low at first, like a groan under the earth. Then rising, long, guttural, stretched between breath and grief. It wasn't a wolf. She'd heard wolves. It wasn't bear either. The sound had weight, not just in volume, but in its ache. Like something large and wild was breaking apart just beyond the trees. She froze. Another cry followed, a rasping, desperate sound, strangled at the end. The air seemed to fold around it. Her fingers tightened on the doorknob. She told herself to sit down. Ignore it. Old ears make strange companions in the dark. But her feet had other plans. She stepped onto the porch, wrapped her shawl tight, and waited. The trees swayed, golden leaves twisting to the ground. There it was again, fainter now, but no less haunting. She strained her eyes toward the slope beyond the garden, toward the line where light ended and shadows breathed. Nothing moved. Still, the sound had rooted inside her. Not just the noise, but what it carried. Something wounded, something alone. Back inside, she lit 2 candles. One for Peter, one for whatever cried out there in the timberline. She left the door bolted but sat close, her chair angled toward the night. That evening she didn't touch her soup, didn't read from the old Bible. She only listened, to the wind, to the creaks in the walls, to that emptiness between breaths when the mountains seemed to whisper things no one else could hear. When the music box played its final note that night, Eleanor stayed awake long after the melody faded. The wind had picked up, rattling the pine cones loose. She pulled the quilt tighter and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, something shifted again, faint branches snapping, a slow crunch in the underbrush. She closed her eyes but didn't sleep. Morning came brittle and bright. Frost veiled the pumpkins on the porch. She stepped out early, eyes scanning the tree line without meaning to. The woods looked the same, but she knew they weren't. That sound, whatever it had been, was still in her bones. And somehow, so was the feeling it left behind. A kind of reaching, like a hand in the dark. Down in town, she didn't mention it. Mrs. Langley asked about the weather. Reverend Cole offered her a basket of late apples. Eleanor smiled, nodded, thanked them. But the ache remained behind her ribs. Not fear. Something else. Recognition. Back home, she stood at the edge of her garden and stared at the ridge. Granite Peak loomed vast and gold, its flanks brushed with early snow. For years, folks had whispered about things in these woods. Shadows in the fog. Footprints too wide for any man. Once, a boy claimed he saw a face peering through the trees, twice his height, with eyes like coal and hair like moss. The town laughed it off. Tall tales, they called it. Spirits. Tricks of light. Eleanor never argued. She just listened. She'd always believed there were things older than maps could name. That evening, as dusk poured over the hills like ink, she gathered pine cones from beneath the old oak and stacked them by the hearth. The air was colder now. Smoke curled from her chimney. A lone hawk circled overhead, silent. She lit her lantern, made tea, opened Peter's photo album. Her fingers hesitated over the pages. The boy with the dimpled grin. The man she never got to see grow old. A gust pushed at the window pane. The flame flickered. And there it was again, farther off this time, but unmistakable. A cry, long, mournful, carried on the wind like an old hymn twisted by pain. Eleanor stood, her chest tightened. But she didn't tremble. She walked to the door and set her hand on the latch. And just for a moment, she thought she saw movement at the edge of the trees. Something massive, too tall, slipping between trunks with the silence of snowfall. Then it was gone. She didn't speak. She simply turned off the lamp and sat by the fire, music box resting in her lap, the mountain's breath curling at her windows. Out there in the dark, something had cried, and something in her had answered. The first snow always came quiet. It drifted down that evening like a secret passed between trees. Thin at first, then thick enough to blur the line where forest met sky. Eleanor sat by the fire, cradling a chipped mug in both hands, eyes tracing the flicker of flame like it might speak. Outside, the wind didn't howl. It whispered. Something low and steady and old, like breath pressed through a cracked door. She hadn't touched her supper. The soup had gone cold. Her boots were by the door, dry and waiting, but her coat was already on her shoulders. It had started again. That sound. The one from a week ago. She'd heard it faint over the ridge just after dusk. One long cry, rough and full of gravel, trailing off like it didn't know how to stop. Not an animal sound. Not something made by hunger or warning. It was sorrow, and she'd felt it like a pull under her ribs. She lit the lantern and stepped outside. The snow caught in her hair, crunched under her soles. The trees stood thick and still, their trunks like dark pillars pressed deep into the slope. She moved slow, every step careful. The light of her lantern swung in soft golden arcs across the snowpack. That sound had come from east of the garden, near the edge of the gulch where the land dipped into a narrow ravine, thick with thorns and old stone. She didn't know why she was going, only that something needed her. The cold bit sharper as she went deeper. Her breath fogged the glass of the lantern. A crow barked once from high above, then went quiet. She followed the sound, not by ear anymore, but by instinct. Branches scratched at her sleeves. Somewhere under the snow, a stream gurgled unseen. Then she heard it again, not the cry, but something faster. Wet, sharp breathing. Movement. A low, ragged growl. Cut off, like it came from a throat too tired to finish. She pushed through a veil of fir boughs and stopped cold. There, in the shadow of a split boulder, half collapsed with frost and root, was something massive, curled forward, breathing shallow. Its back rose and fell like slow waves in deep water. At first, all she saw was fur, thick, matted, dark as ash and streaked with clots of blood. Then her lantern caught the glint of metal. A trap, the old kind. Illegal now. Meant for bears. Its rusted jaws clamped tight around a thick ankle, and the snow beneath was soaked red, steaming in the cold. She almost dropped the lantern. The creature stirred. One massive arm shifted slightly. Then a head lifted, slowly, as if every movement took effort. Its face caught the light, covered in fur, but unmistakably shaped. Not animal, not human. Somewhere between. And its eyes, those eyes, met hers, amber and glassy, but sharp, present, not panicked, not wild, just pain, and something beneath it, understanding. Her fingers trembled. It could have leapt, could have torn her down with one swipe, but it didn't move, just watched. She stepped forward. The snow came up to her knees. Her breath was loud now, uneven. She held up the lantern with one hand, and with the other reached for the crowbar tied to her belt. She hadn't meant to bring it. It was just there from the woodpile. But now it felt like fate. She knelt beside the trap. Her knees burned from the cold. She could smell the blood, iron, sharp, real. The creature didn't flinch. She wedged the crowbar into the hinge of the jaws, bracing her whole body weight against it. The metal shrieked as it gave. A gasp, deep from the thing's chest, escaped as the trap sprang open. It didn't move right away. The leg slid free, trembling. The fur was torn, muscle exposed, snow darkening beneath. It looked at her again. Then slowly, too slowly, it gathered itself. One hand pressed to the ground, the other dragged across its knee for support. It rose, shaky, towering above her. At least 7 feet. Maybe more, but it didn't bare teeth. Didn't growl. It looked down at her, chest heaving, breath fogging the air between them. Then, with a limp that made Eleanor's throat tighten, it turned and walked into the trees. She stayed there a long while, kneeling in the snow, crowbar forgotten in the ice. Somewhere deep in the woods, a branch snapped. She turned her head. At the edge of the darkness, half hidden behind a spruce trunk, something smaller shifted. Another one, much smaller, barely 5 feet. Its fur was lighter, its frame thinner. A child, if such things had children. It stared at her with the same eyes, wide and unblinking, as if memorizing her face. Its little hands gripped the bark like it needed to hold still. Then it ducked back into the shadows, vanishing without sound. Eleanor's heart felt like it would crack in two. She stood slowly, knees popping, breath catching in her chest. She followed the edge of the ravine back home, lantern dimming, snow falling heavier now. By the time she reached the porch, the hem of her skirt was stiff with frost. Inside, she peeled off her coat with shaking fingers. Set the lantern down. Didn't light the stove. Didn't change. She just stood in the center of her quiet home, staring at the floor. She'd seen something that didn't fit in any book. Something with pain in its eyes and trust in its silence. And that little one, its presence, just a flicker, was somehow worse than the wound, worse than the blood. It meant something more. A family. She sat in her chair, staring at the flame. Her hand still tingled. Her chest ached with something too large to name. Not fear, not pity. Recognition again, and something close to belonging. Outside, the wind picked up. It rattled the shutters like fingers dragging along wood. She played the music box. The hymn spun slowly through the room, thin and cracked. She closed her eyes, and this time, she whispered into the dark, not expecting an answer. "Who are you?" There was no reply. Only the soft creak of trees bending under snow. But somewhere in her bones, the question didn't hang empty. It echoed, and far off, through the storm, something heard her. Snow still blanketed the ground, though the sky had softened to a pale, forgiving gray. The storm had passed. Wind no longer cut across the trees like a blade, and even the pine branches seemed to exhale. Eleanor stood at the window with both hands curled around a chipped mug of tea. The room behind her was still. The music box sat closed beside the oil lamp. She hadn't opened it since that night. The one with the trap, the one with the eyes. She hadn't spoken of it. Not to the grocer in town, not to the mailman who left her seed catalog. Not even to herself. She hadn't dreamed it. She knew that with the same certainty she knew the weight of Peter's old coat, the scent of pine sap clinging to her steps, the way the creature, no he, looked at her when the trap snapped open. Solomon. She didn't know why the name fit. It just did. Wise, weathered, wounded. She hadn't said it aloud, but it lived now in her thoughts like breath. She had carried him with her through every movement since. The peeling of potatoes, the folding of linens, the quiet pressing of her fingers to the frame of her son's photo. And then came the fish. It was early. Still morning gray. Snow melting in patches along the edges of her porch. She had just opened the door to shake out the rug when she saw it. A trout. Fresh. Thick and cold. Laid neatly on the top step like it had been placed there with care. Not dropped. Not clawed. No footprints around it, though the snow hadn't melted entirely. But farther off, where the tree line began, there were indentations, wide, spaced far apart, leading back into the woods. She blinked at the fish. It stared back with glassy eyes. Eleanor dropped the rug without shaking it. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the impossible weight of understanding. She picked up the trout, wrapped it gently in an old kitchen towel, and carried it inside like an offering made in reverse. Her heart beat louder than her boots on the floor. She lit the stove, scaled the fish, salted it lightly. She ate slowly, reverently, like the act itself was part of a promise. And that afternoon, she walked into the woods with a basket. She didn't go far, just to the clearing where the trees bent slightly inward, the place where bluebells grew in spring. There, at the base of a wide oak, she knelt and placed 3 things. A ripe red apple, 2 handfuls of unshelled hazelnuts, and an old silk ribbon, sky blue, once used to bind the hymnals at church. She stepped back, said nothing. Then she walked home. That night she couldn't sleep, not because she was afraid, because something in her felt watched, but in the way you feel when someone's looking out for you. It was strange. sweet, disorienting. The wind rattled the windows like soft fingers. She lit the oil lamp. The fire popped in the hearth, and, after a long pause, she reached for the music box. The crank creaked as she turned it. The melody began, slow, warbled, familiar. Somewhere far off, deep in the black space between trunks, a low sound answered. Not a growl, not a cry. Something between a hum and a sigh, rising just enough to say, "I hear you." She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." The next morning she found a trail of pine cones arranged in a gentle arc near the edge of her garden. That same afternoon, she saw them. She had gone to the shed for more firewood. The door creaked open and the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. She turned, arms full of logs, and froze. At the edge of the clearing stood two shapes, far enough to run if they wanted, close enough to be seen if they chose. Solomon stood tall, foot slightly bandaged with what looked like tree bark and woven grass. Next to him was the smaller one, Juniper. She hadn't named them before, but now the name felt certain, like it had always belonged. The little one looked directly at her, its head tilted with childlike curiosity. One hand clutched something round. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't speak. The air hung between them, brittle but not broken. A thin cord stretched across the space. Neither of them pulled. Then Juniper made a sound, soft, like tapping wood. 3 slow knocks on the trunk behind him. Eleanor blinked. It felt like a greeting. Solomon never looked away. His eyes were unreadable, but not cold. They stayed there for a few seconds longer. Then together they turned and disappeared into the trees. The next few days unfolded like pieces in a quiet dance. She'd leave offerings at the base of the oak, dried cranberries, sugar cubes, bits of fabric, and they'd leave gifts in return. A bundle of wildflowers bound with twine, a smooth river stone placed gently on the porch rail. Once, a cluster of feathers, arranged in a perfect spiral, every gesture built upon the last. One evening, as the snow began to melt in patches and the birds returned to sing their slow, reedy songs, Eleanor opened the music box again. This time she left the door open. She didn't see them, but she felt them, watching, listening. And from deep in the trees, that same low answering sound rose again, like an echo, like a vow, and something in her, something old and sore and long left untouched, began to knit itself back together, not fast, but true. The wind returned like an old warning. It had teeth this time, biting through the cracks in the cabin walls, crawling beneath the rug, rattling the stovepipe like it meant to speak. Snow hadn't started yet, but the air had turned metallic, the kind of cold that made the birds vanish early and the dogs whimper without cause. Eleanor stood at her porch rail, staring out into the thicket where the pines leaned just enough to whisper to each other. She knew that hush. She'd lived through enough Montana winters to feel the storm before it showed. But this one was different. It wasn't just weather. It was presence. In town, people had started talking. First, it was Mrs. Langley at the bakery, saying how her radio cut out every time she mentioned the ridge. Then Harold at the post office, muttering something about lights in the woods and missing salt licks. Most of it, Eleanor could ignore. But not the missing children. Not Sophie and Ben. 2 kids, 10 and 8, gone. The whole town had heard by sundown. A family hike gone wrong. Their father had turned for a moment, just to retie a boot, he said, and when he looked back, they were gone. No prints, no broken branches. Just gone. Eleanor hadn't said much when the sheriff knocked on her door. Just shook her head. Told him no, she hadn't seen them. But she felt it deep in her bones, like a hollow knock behind her breastbone. Something was off. Something was waiting. She barely slept that night. The wind wouldn't quit. It sang through the rafters and howled at the chimney. Trees groaned against their roots. The glass in the windows quivered in its frame. Then, just past midnight, came a new sound. A thud on the porch, solid, deliberate. She reached for the lantern, her fingers steady despite the dread building in her chest. She unlatched the door and opened it slow. And there he was, Solomon, standing in the middle of the snow-dusted porch like a statue carved from shadow. His shoulders were dusted with frost. His breath curled visibly in the air between them. He didn't move, didn't growl, just looked at her the way a man might look at an old friend when words wouldn't come. And then he turned, not away, but outward, toward the forest. He paused, looked back, waited. Her heart was loud in her chest. She didn't hesitate. She pulled on her wool coat, snatched the lantern, and stepped out barefoot into the cold. She didn't even feel it. Solomon didn't look back again. He moved ahead, quiet but swift, and she followed like she'd done this her whole life. The snow was just beginning, small flakes swirling in the lantern light. Each step took her deeper into the forest, and deeper into something she couldn't name. The trees closed around them. The wind screamed once and then stilled, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Eleanor kept her eyes on the faint shape ahead of her. Solomon moved like he belonged to the woods, not walking but flowing through them. And even with his size, he never snapped a branch. She followed his path through drifts and between boulders slick with ice. Her breath came faster, her legs trembling, but she didn't stop. Then he paused. Just ahead, in a break between two ridge walls, was a hollow in the stone, barely large enough for a man to crawl through. Solomon stood beside it, his hand resting gently on a birch tree. His head turned toward her, but again, no sound, no gesture, only the knowing in his eyes. She stepped closer and held the lantern toward the hollow. Two small forms lay curled beneath a makeshift roof of pine limbs. Sophie, Ben. Their faces were pale, lips tinged blue, but their chests rose and fell. Alive. Eleanor dropped to her knees, the snow soaking through her skirt. She set the lantern down and reached for them with trembling hands. Sophie stirred first, whispering something incoherent, eyes fluttering. Ben didn't move, but the heat of his breath fogged the space between them. She pulled them close, wrapping them both in her coat, heart thudding like thunder in her ears. When she looked up, Solomon was gone. No sound, no trail, just the forest, heavy and breathless again. But at the mouth of the hollow, there was a gift, a pine branch, small, green, fresh. She understood. She didn't try to explain anything to the search party when she stumbled out of the woods with the children wrapped in her arms just before dawn. Flashlights blinded her. Radios crackled. Someone shouted. Then she was on her knees, arms empty, as Sophie and Ben were pulled from her and wrapped in blankets. Their parents sobbed. Someone shouted her name. She just closed her eyes. When they asked how she found them, she simply said, "The forest showed me." No one questioned it, not really, because they'd been searching for days. Dogs couldn't find them. Helicopters missed the crevice entirely. But Eleanor, an old widow with nothing but a lantern and instinct, had brought them back alive. She walked home alone. The wind had stopped. The sky was beginning to lighten. She stepped onto her porch and paused. Her fingers brushed the rail, warm from the first kiss of sunlight. There, nestled between two slats, was a tuft of fur, thick, coarse, dark. She took it gently and placed it in the music box drawer. That night she lit a single candle and let it burn to the nub. The hymn played soft and clear. She didn't say a word. But from far beyond the trees, something answered. Not loud, not near, but enough. And she knew, without seeing, that somewhere out there, he was still watching. By nightfall, the storm was no longer a rumor. It was real. A wall of white clawing its way down from the north, swallowing trees, bending fences, smothering every sound in its path. The kind of storm that swallowed your sense of direction, made your breath burn in your chest, and your thoughts clatter like shutters in the wind. The kind of storm that killed. Eleanor had prepared as best she could. She'd stacked extra wood by the hearth, boiled potatoes, wrapped quilts around the windows, but none of it quieted her nerves. She sat by the fire with the music box in her lap, unopened. The candle sputtered low, Every few minutes, she glanced toward the door as if someone might knock. But the knock never came. It didn't have to, because she felt him. Not just a presence, but a shift in the air. Like something tall and watchful stood just beyond the glass, waiting. Not for permission, not even for comfort, but for trust. She rose and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. Lantern. Boots. The door opened with a moan and shut with a thud that was instantly eaten by the wind. He was there. Solomon, half shadow, half flesh. Snow clinging to the curve of his shoulder, steam rising from his fur. He stood at the edge of her porch like the storm had carved a path just for him. He didn't motion, didn't growl. He simply turned and stepped into the whiteness. She followed. No questions. The snow was thigh-deep in places, icy needles whipping her face. But she didn't stop. The light from her lantern danced wildly, catching on branches and gusts of flurries. The forest was no longer still. It groaned, cracked, roared like something waking up angry. Eleanor kept her eyes on Solomon's outline ahead, sometimes clear, sometimes swallowed in white. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time melted in the cold. Then the trees thinned. A narrow gulch opened ahead, barely noticeable if you weren't looking. Wind funneled through it with a sound like a scream muffled by distance. Solomon moved slower now, more deliberate. He stopped near a slant of broken rock, jagged and half covered in snow, and Eleanor saw them. Two small forms, curled, still. At first her legs refused to move. Her body caught between memory and now, of Peter in the clearing, the rifle accident, the blood. But this wasn't then. These children were breathing. Faint, shallow, but alive. She scrambled forward, nearly dropping the lantern. Sophie was nestled into Ben, his face blue at the edges, his lips parted, breath misting just barely. Eleanor unwrapped her coat, shaking as she pulled them both against her chest. They didn't wake, didn't stir. But she felt the heat begin to pool between them. She looked up. Solomon hadn't moved. He stood near the mouth of the crevice, one hand pressed against the rock as if keeping watch. His eyes weren't on her. They were watching the storm, listening. She wanted to thank him, but the words felt too small. Instead, she whispered into the boy's ear, "You're safe now, baby. You're going home." Then she rose and began the walk back. Solomon didn't follow. She turned once and saw him still standing there, snow sweeping past his form like time itself couldn't touch him. She would later swear, though only to herself, that he nodded. Just once. The barest tilt of his head. But it said everything. The wind pushed against her body like a wall. The children were heavy, their limbs limp, their weight dragging at her spine, but she held them tighter and pressed on. Each step was a prayer, each breath a fight. But something deeper moved her forward. Not adrenaline, not instinct, faith. She lost her way twice, had to double back when the trees all looked the same and the lantern guttered low. And then, through the blur of ice, she saw it, the outline of her own porch. She stumbled forward, boots dragging, legs numb, and just as her knees gave out, the front door burst open. Voices, hands grabbing, lifting, crying, and then warmth. The stove, the quilts, the sobs of a mother who thought her babies were gone forever. She sat on the floor, back against the wall, breath shallow, hands trembling. Someone gave her tea. Someone else wrapped her in a blanket, but she barely noticed, because in her palm, almost forgotten, was a sprig of pine. Still green, still warm, tucked into the fold of Ben's jacket like a ribbon. She closed her fingers around it and brought it to her chest. That night, when the wind finally died, and the town slept under a new blanket of snow, she sat alone by the fire. The music box played. The hymn filled the room like breath, and somewhere out in the dark, past the edge of all understanding, something answered with a sound that was neither song nor cry, just presence, just him. The snow had barely begun to melt when the whispers started. It wasn't just Eleanor anymore. Not just a widow tucked away in the woods with her memories and her silence. This time, the whole town had seen something they couldn't explain, and more importantly, something they couldn't deny. 2 children returned from the brink. No footprints, no compass, no miracle they could name. Only an old woman with wind-burned cheeks and frost-bitten fingers who said, with simple certainty, "The forest showed me." It didn't take long for the story to change hands. At first, it passed over counters and coffee cups, at the feed store, at the diner, behind the post office where the men smoked. But soon it seeped into the fabric of the town itself. Sophie and Ben were back. That was real. Their father swore he'd heard something in the trees. Low, deep, not human, not beast. Something that sent shivers down his spine. He'd never seen anything, but he wouldn't go back out there alone. Not again. And when the local newspaper ran the front page column, The Granite Peak Woman and the Mountain Guardian, people didn't laugh. They read it quietly. Reverend Cole clipped the article and pinned it outside the church. A copy showed up in the school hallway, stuck between drawings of snowmen and stars. And something in the town shifted. Not loudly, not overnight, but like a breath being held just a little less tightly. Eleanor didn't say much. She swept her porch, boiled her tea. She let them talk. And when the first drawing showed up, crayons on construction paper taped to the church bulletin board, she stood and stared at it for a long time. It was simple, childlike. A tall figure beside a smaller one, both covered in brown scribbles, with stick arms and wide feet. Beside them, a woman in a long blue coat. The forest towered over them like a cathedral. At the bottom, in bright red marker, it said, "Thank you for saving us. Ben." Eleanor didn't cry. But that night, when she lit her candle and opened the music box, she pressed one hand over her heart and let the hymn wash through her like warm water. Outside, the wind had gone still, and in that stillness, she heard it. A low sound. A rumble carried through the branches. Not quite voice, not quite echo, but something that felt like acknowledgement. Something that wasn't meant to be heard with ears alone. The town changed slowly, but it changed. The church held a service not long after the thaw, but it wasn't about doctrine. Not really. Reverend Cole called it a mountain spirit gathering. He said it was a way to say thank you. To the forest, to faith, to whatever force had led Eleanor that night. The pews were full. Children sat with candles in their laps. Old-timers stood in the back with hats pressed to their chests. No one mentioned Bigfoot, not directly, but they spoke of guardians, of the sacredness of land, of the unspoken bonds between man and the wild when the wild decides it can trust you. Eleanor was there, seated near the front. She wore Peter's coat, the one he never got to wear past 16. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The room knew who she was now. Not just a woman with a past, but a woman who had stepped into the dark and come back holding something more than just survival. That night, candles were placed along the edge of the woods, flickering lines of light like prayers you don't know how to say out loud. Some kids left fruit. Others tied ribbon to branches. One girl placed a handmade sign at the trailhead. "We see you. Thank you." The next morning, half the candles were gone. So was the sign. But in their place was a row of smooth stones, laid out carefully, each marked with a slash of charcoal like a primitive language. Eleanor saw them on her way to the postbox. She didn't touch them, just smiled, then walked home slower than usual, feeling less alone. When spring came, the town council passed a quiet vote. No more expansion permits near Granite Peak. No more hunting past the old fire road. Officially, it was about conservation. Privately, everyone knew. Even the men who didn't say much anymore, especially them. A fund was started at the library. A new trail sign was made. Not a warning, not a legend, just a plaque carved into cedar. Respect the wild. It remembers you. By May, the forest was green again. Eleanor's garden bloomed brighter than it had in years. She still left apples at the base of the ridge. Still lit the candle every evening. Still heard the faint replies. Less often now, but never absent. And when children drew pictures in Sunday school, they sometimes added tall shadows behind the trees. Some showed up on the back steps of the church. One had 3 figures now, not just 2. She kept that one, tucked it inside her Bible. Not because she needed proof, but because it made her smile. It wasn't peace, not exactly, but it was the closest she'd ever come. And as the wind picked up again in early summer, brushing through the pines with that familiar hush, she felt something shifting again, not ending, just beginning to turn. Spring slipped in quietly, like it didn't want to disturb anything. The snow melted in slow sighs, one patch at a time. Ice retreated from the creek beds. Moss reached for the sun. The forest, so long asleep, began to murmur again. Eleanor moved slower now, but she didn't mind. Her knees ached when she crouched to plant onions. Her hands curled tight at night. But something inside her had loosened. Like an old knot finally come undone. She no longer expected the loneliness to sting. Now it came like a memory that had softened at the edges. Still there, just gentler. Each week she left offerings again. She never skipped. Sometimes it was an apple with its skin shining like varnish. Sometimes dried cherries or oats or a scrap of her best cloth. She placed them carefully at the boulder near the tree line, like setting the table for someone who might come late but never forgot. And they always responded. The first time that spring, she found a bundle of bluebells tied with dried grass. The next week, a smooth stone shaped like a heart. Then a tiny arch of twigs, woven into a half moon, tucked behind her porch railing. Their language was different, but not foreign. Not anymore. She could feel Juniper watching her sometimes, from behind the thick curtain of trees. Taller now, growing quickly. Not a child anymore. Not yet grown. Once, when the dusk was just dipping behind the ridge and the wind was warm, she saw the young one raise a hand. Just slightly, fingers half curled, as if waving. Then vanished again into the brush, but the moment stayed with her. So did the sounds. Some evenings she'd hear the knock, wood on wood. Slow, steady, rhythmic, not random. Almost like a lullaby, or a code only the mountains knew. That summer she slipped while tending the garden. Her ankle twisted beneath her, sudden and sharp. She cried out, more in surprise than pain. But no one heard, except maybe someone did. Because when she looked up, through the shimmer of heat and haze, she saw him, Solomon, at the edge of the woods, motionless. His dark shape against the green, still as stone, watching, not approaching, just being there. Her heart thudded once, hard, and then steadied. She didn't wave, didn't speak. She just lay there a moment longer, soaking in the silence between them. And when she managed to crawl to the porch and prop herself up with her cane, he was already gone. The next morning, beside the steps, was a strip of deer hide, wound around 3 slender birch twigs, like a splint, like an offering of help. She smiled and tucked it beside the windowsill where she kept Peter's whistle and the old shell from her honeymoon in Oregon. Small relics from 2 different worlds that had begun to blur. Nights were the most beautiful. After supper, when the light stretched long and golden across the porch, she would sit with her knitting. Not to keep warm, not anymore, but to give her hands something to do while the world hushed itself. Juniper sometimes appeared then. Further back, almost shy. Not hiding, not quite visible. A flicker of movement behind the dogwoods. The tilt of a head. The twitch of a shoulder. Once, when she played the music box outside, the notes drifting through the pine-scented air, she caught sight of him crouched low, listening. His face softer than she remembered. Tilted in curiosity, the way children look at wind chimes or rain against glass. He stayed for 3 full songs, then slipped away before darkness could ask questions. She didn't follow, didn't call out. Whatever they shared didn't need words. One morning she left a ring of bread pieces at the edge of the clearing. Not in a pile, not tossed. Laid out, careful, in a perfect oval. She had no reason, no plan, just felt like it was the right shape. The next day, she found it replaced. Small river stones, each one smooth, some still damp, arranged in a crescent, pointing toward the porch. She leaned against the railing and let the wind lift her hair. Later that week, she left an old scarf, soft, handmade, faded pink and lopsided, but still warm. She draped it over the chair on the porch. The next morning it was still there, but folded, neat, and placed atop it was a pine branch, deep green, fresh as if plucked from the center of summer itself. That evening clouds rolled in, not heavy yet, but sure. The wind changed direction. The smell of cold returned, subtle, like the breath of something not yet spoken. She made tea, lit the fire, and settled into her rocking chair, then looked up. 3 figures stood in the clearing, far enough not to intrude, close enough to see. Solomon, taller than she remembered, still watching, Juniper beside him, straighter now, legs longer, head no longer tilted in wonder but in quiet respect. And between them, just behind, a pace off center, a third, taller than both, broader, fur darker and longer, streaked with silver and shadow. The eyes were different, deeper, older, wiser, not male, not female, just other. The air shifted around her like it did around trees that had survived fire and flood. Kaya, she didn't move. Neither did they. The air between them was thick with stillness, but not tension. No fear, just recognition, a family, whole. And then, like mist lifting from morning grass, they turned. No sound, no farewell, just presence. Then absence, and she was alone again. But not really. Not ever again. She sat until the sun slipped behind the hill, the last light draping the porch in gold. Her scarf still folded, the pine branch beside it. She didn't touch either, just breathed, and when she stood to go inside, her chest felt tight. Not pain, not yet, but something pulled low and slow, like a tide beginning to shift. That night she coughed, a deep one, the kind that rattles more than it clears. She didn't worry. She simply lit her candle, opened the music box, and let the notes float through the open window, where the wind had begun to hum again. By morning the porch was bare except for one thing, a single wildflower blooming out of season, purple, soft, alone, but not lost. Winter returned without asking, not the kind that howled or tore down branches, but a softer kind, a final breath, cold, still, steady. By the time the snow began to settle again over Granite Peak, the wildflower had faded on the porch rail. Its color dulled, its petals curled inward like fingers folding into sleep. Eleanor hadn't touched it. She simply let it stay until the wind took it. The coughing had worsened. Not constant, not violent, just deeper. Like something inside her had begun to sink, slow and quiet. She still made her tea, still swept the porch, still left her gifts at the tree line, even when her legs didn't want to carry her that far. She hummed while she worked. Old hymns, mostly. Some she hadn't sung since Peter's voice cracked with adolescence beside her in church. The melodies came back on their own. One morning she rose before the light. The windows had frosted overnight. Her breath clouded the glass as she peered out. Snow blanketed everything again, soft and perfect. And there, just beyond the edge of the garden, she saw them. 3 shapes. Still watching. She smiled and lit the stove. There was nothing left undone, nothing to fear. The world had grown quiet around her. Not silent, just full of listening. She opened the drawer where she kept the music box. Peter's whistle, the feather bundle, the piece of hide, the pine sprig, now dry and faded, but still fragrant. One by one, she laid them on the table. Then she picked up the old photo album. Worn corners, yellowing pages. She ran her fingers along the spine like tracing the memory of a shoulder long gone. She took it to bed with her. Snow kept falling outside, steady, gentle. She lit a single candle, turned the crank. The music box played soft and slow. And as the notes faded into the folds of the quilt, Eleanor Briggs closed her eyes and did not open them again. It was 2 days before anyone noticed. The mail carrier thought she must be sick. Mrs. Langley had a pie wrapped in foil, unsure if she'd find her up or resting. They knocked, then knocked again, then pushed the door open. They found her peaceful, still. Her hands resting on the photo album, her face turned toward the window. The candle had burned low beside her. The room smelled of pine and lavender and old wood smoke. They didn't touch anything, not at first. They just stood there, heads bowed, the hush settling around them like the snow outside. And then someone gasped. The porch, covered in snow, untouched, except for the footprints. Huge, bare, wide-spaced, pressed clean into the white. A perfect circle. No beginning, no end, just a ring. The sheriff was called. So was the paper. No one touched the prints, not for hours. Not until the snow began again and the wind swept them gently away. But not before they were seen. Not before they were believed. The funeral was held 4 days later. The church was full. More people than Eleanor had spoken to in years. Children holding candles. Teenagers who'd once drawn monsters now drawing guardians. Old hunters who'd put their rifles in storage. New mothers who kept rosemary tucked above their doors. They came to say goodbye, but it felt more like bearing witness. Someone read a passage about kindness. Someone else talked about courage. No one mentioned Bigfoot. No one had to. After the burial, a little girl tugged at her father's coat sleeve. She said, "Daddy, I saw them." He knelt. "Saw what, sweetheart?" She pointed toward the trees. There were 3 of them. They were standing there, watching. They didn't look scary. The man looked toward the forest. Nothing moved. Just trees, just snow. But still, he nodded. "I believe you." And he did. The town changed again after that. This time, permanently. A new sign was carved and posted at the trailhead leading to Eleanor's cabin. Eleanor's refuge, dedicated to peace between worlds. Below it, etched into the wood, were words not from scripture but older. Be kind, the forest remembers. Children were taught not to litter near the ridgeline. Tourists were given maps with blank spaces where the forest was deepest. The mountain spirit gathering became an annual vigil. And every year, on the first snowfall, something happened. Footprints, large, bare, silent, circling the cabin, never crossing, never broken, just there. Some years someone would leave apples, others a scarf, a drawing, a pine cone, and the next morning the snow would be undisturbed except for the ring, like a whisper pressed into the earth. And those who came to see it felt something shift inside. Not fear, something quieter, something true. No one ever moved into the cabin. Not out of superstition, not exactly. It just wasn't empty. Not really. And when the wind came through the valley now, it didn't moan like it used to. It hummed, low and round, like a voice too big for language, still trying to say thank you, or goodbye, or maybe just, "I'm here." Sometimes what saves us isn't loud. It doesn't wear a name. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or knock at the door demanding to be seen. Sometimes it waits, quiet and patient, just beyond the edge of what we understand. And if we're still enough, if we're brave enough to listen, we might hear it breathing in the wind. We might feel it watching, not to judge, not to harm, but to remember that we're still here, that we're not alone. This story is a reminder that the world is older than we are, wilder than maps, deeper than fear. There are places that don't need us to conquer them, only to witness. There are silences that don't ask to be filled, only honored. And there are connections that don't rely on words, only on trust. Grief lingers. Time passes. But healing doesn't always look like forgetting. Sometimes it's a candle lit in the dark, a gift left with no expectation, a song played for no one, and yet, somehow, heard. The most sacred things are often unseen, and the kindest gestures often come from those who owe us nothing. What matters isn't the noise we make while we're here. It's the quiet we leave behind, the footprints we press gently into the lives of others, the circles we walk around those we care for, not to trap them, but to keep them safe. There is great strength in gentleness. There is power in simply showing up again and again with love in your hands and nothing to prove. And perhaps the most important truths aren't carved into stone or shouted across mountaintops. They're passed down in the hush between stories, in the trust between hearts, in the way we treat the unknown, not with fear, but with dignity. If this story spoke to something in you, something quiet, something tender, we invite you to carry it with care. Let it stay with you in whatever form it needs to take. And if you feel moved, please share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to know what stayed with you. Don't forget to subscribe and follow this channel if you'd like to hear more stories like this. Stories that echo late into the night. Stories meant to be felt more than explained. Thank you for listening, truly. We'll see you in the next one. Until then, be kind. The forest remembers.